This is the second of two tutorials on monopolistic markets. So we saw in the last tutorial that monopolies are inefficient because they result in a deadweight loss compared with perfect competition, and that's due to the smaller quantity of the good that's traded. Because of that inefficiency, and to protect consumers from having to pay high prices, there are laws in place in most countries that restrict monopolies. So in Canada, this is regulated under the Competition Act. The Competition Act can be used to prevent mergers between firms that would result in a monopoly being formed. It also restricts some of the deliberate barriers that firms use to protect their monopolies. So for example, predatory pricing is illegal under the Act. So are some of the exclusionary practices we talked about, like making a deal with a retailer not to sell your competitor's product. There are, however, some situations where monopolies might not be inefficient, or at least might not be as bad as this analysis tells us. So in those cases, it might actually be best to allow the monopoly to exist. So remember that one of the reasons why there can be a monopoly is economies of scale. So this is one of the economic barriers. It could be the case that the minimum efficient scale in a particular industry is actually so large that one firm operating at that level can meet all consumer demand for the product. And this is what we call a natural monopoly. So natural monopolies are especially common in utilities like wastewater treatment and power generation, where the minimum efficient scale is very large. In that kind of situation, it actually makes sense to just have one firm in the market. If you divided the market among multiple smaller firms, they would all be operating below minimum efficient scale, which means their costs would be high and they would have to charge high prices. Now, just because a monopolist has low average cost doesn't necessarily mean that they will charge low prices. And we saw previously that monopolists have an incentive to charge high prices to maximize their profits. But the point is that they could charge a lower price and still cover their average costs. So typically what the government will do in this kind of situation is regulate the monopoly to ensure that it sells a larger quantity, enough to meet consumer demand, and charges a lower price than it would choose to do on its own, while still making what we consider to be a fair amount of profit. The other alternative is for the government to actually own the monopoly itself and to run it. So in Canada, typically this means running the monopoly as an arm's length crown corporation that's owned by the government but managed independently. And that's what we do with lots of crown corporations like Via Rail, Canada Post, EPCOR, and many other monopolies that are present. A second situation where monopolies can be okay is in the case of legal barriers that are intended to protect intellectual property. So for example, a patent on a drug gives the company a monopoly on that drug and allows the company to charge a high price. That's not ideal for consumers. But on the other hand, drugs are extremely expensive to develop. If the company couldn't capture a high price for its product that would allow it to make back those costs that it spent on developing the product, it's very unlikely that it would be willing to put the resource into developing the drug in the first place. So these legally based monopolies are actually intended to encourage research and development into new technologies and products. Even though customers have to pay a lot for the product, they're probably better off than if the product had never been developed in the first place. So patents and copyrights typically last for a couple of decades. Copyrights last longer than patents, and then they expire. So the idea is that the company has some time to earn high profits, which allows it to cover the costs of its research and development, and then eventually the good becomes available for cheaper as the patent expires and new companies enter the market. A third possibility is that even when a monopoly exists, it might behave similarly to a competitive firm. So it might choose not to charge as high prices as it could if, for example, it fears that charging high prices would attract competitors into the market. So remember that economic barriers involve being able to charge lower prices than a competitor, which prevents competitors from entering the market. So monopolists might choose to charge those low prices in order to prevent competitors from trying to take away their market share. The other reason why monopolists might try to appear competitive is because they don't want to attract attention from the government. So violating the Competition Act by abusing your monopoly power in a variety of different ways can mean facing fines or jail time. So monopolies might choose to keep prices low in order to avoid annoying consumers and drawing the attention of the government, triggering an investigation into their business practices. A fourth possibility is that a monopolist may practice price discrimination. So price discrimination means that the monopolist charges different prices to different consumers, depending on their willingness to pay. So in this example, suppose the monopolist wanted to sell quantity Q. If they could only charge one price to everybody, they would charge PD. But suppose they could identify which of their consumers would be willing to pay more than PD for the good. So for example, they know that consumer A is willing to pay a very high price, so they charge PA just to that consumer. Consumer B isn't willing to pay quite as much as consumer A, but still more than PD, and so on. So there are different ways that firms can identify the consumers that are willing to pay the most. For example, airlines tend to charge more for Monday and Friday flights because they know that business people are most likely to fly on those days. They charge less on weekends because that's when families fly who can afford to pay less. Car salespeople might offer a higher price to customers who appear more wealthy based on their clothing. Companies can offer discounts to consumers who are willing to go to some extra effort to get a deal. So for example, they might have to be willing to fill out a rebate form. That allows those companies to charge a lower price to people who are more price sensitive and are willing to go the extra mile to get a bargain, and a higher price to people who aren't willing to do that. If price discrimination is done perfectly, so charging each customer exactly what they're willing to pay, the monopolist can actually capture all of the consumer surplus as producer surplus. Now that's unrealistic, but the better they can do at this, the more producer surplus they can capture. That does mean that the deadweight loss from monopoly is actually eliminated in this case. So if the monopolist knows which consumers are willing to pay the least, they can charge them just that amount. So that means they're able to sell all of the units where demand is higher than marginal cost. So we actually end up at the perfectly competitive equilibrium, even though we have a monopoly. So the plus side of that for consumers is that consumers who wouldn't have been willing to pay the monopolist price if they had only charged one price can now get the good at a price that they're willing to pay. So for example, a senior living on a fixed income might only be able to buy the good if the firm price discriminates by giving a senior's discount. Now it's important to note that some kinds of price discrimination are actually illegal under the Competition Act. So you're not actually allowed to discriminate among your consumers just based on their willingness to pay. But you are allowed to discriminate among consumers who are different from each other based on some observable characteristics. So different classes or categories of consumers, you're allowed to price discriminate. So for example, it's legal to offer a senior's discount or a discount to students. Now there's one more model that we need to briefly cover here. Monopolistic competition is a hybrid between monopoly and perfect competition. So it's like perfect competition in that there are many sellers and not just one. There's also free entry and exit and perfect information. But the key difference is that instead of selling exactly the same good, each seller sells a differentiated version of the good. So for example, Wendy's, McDonald's, and Burger King all sell hamburgers, but they're all slightly different from each other, and different consumers are likely to prefer one to another. The same is true of clothing sellers, who each have their own brands and styles. Gas stations all sell basically the same gas, but their different locations make them imperfect substitutes for each other. So people might prefer, for example, to go to a gas station because it's located on their way to work. So monopolistic competition is actually a very common type of market. Each monopolistically competitive firm essentially has a monopoly over its particular version of the product. So in the market for that particular version, it makes decisions like a monopolist. But the key difference between monopoly and monopolistic competition is that there is free entry and exit into the market. So no one can enter and sell exactly the same product, but they can enter the market and sell something that's very similar. So what that means is that a monopolistically competitive firm can charge slightly higher prices than it could if it were a perfectly competitive firm, but it can't charge as high prices as a monopolist would, because if its prices are too high, its customers will go to the nearest competitor even if they don't like the product quite as much. So the demand curve for a monopolistically competitive firm isn't fixed. It's determined by the number of similar firms in the market. So the more similar firms in the market, the smaller the demand curve for any particular seller in that market. And that process will continue to happen, just like in perfect competition, as long as there are positive profits to be made. So here's a comparison between perfect competition and monopolistic competition. Monopolistically competitive firms will sell less output than perfectly competitive because they're behaving as a mini monopolist. They will also charge a higher price, but not as high as a monopolist would charge. They make zero economic profits because competitors will continue to enter the market as long as there are positive profits to be made. They will drive down demand until profits are exactly zero. The market is inefficient, partly because the firms are still behaving as monopolists for their section of the market, but also because monopolistically competitive firms tend to spend quite a bit of money on advertising to try to increase their market share. And that's money that's not spent on actually producing more of the product. So in that sense, it's inefficient. To offset that, consumers in this type of market have access to a variety of products, which they don't necessarily have in either perfectly competitive or monopolistic markets. And people tend to like variety. So even though monopolistically competitive markets are inefficient, that's not usually seen as a problem because it's offset by the increase in variety. It's worth it. So usually we allow this kind of market to just exist as is without trying to use government policy to regulate it like we do for monopoly.